Chapter 1. The Manuscript of Kalduma. The journal came to the Antiquarian Guild of Remus, swaddled in bloodied sailcloth, reeking of salt, old leather, and something else, something sickly sweet, like spoiled honey mingled with desert rot. It was delivered by a one-eyed stevedore who refused to cross the building's threshold. He stood under the soot-black awning, muttering prayers to Mermedia with the fervor of a dying man, and swore on the bones of his mother that he'd found the bundle lashed to the figurehead of a derelict Tilean sloop drifting ashore near Sartosa. No crew, no flag, just the journal and a ring of dried blood circling the deck like a ceremonial mark. Archivist Martello was the first to open it. He died 6 days later, feverish and raving, his lips cracked and black with flies nesting in his throat. The cause of death was officially listed as pneumonic plague, but those who'd seen the state of his corpse whispered of glyphs carved into the inside of his eyelids, of a sand-like residue that defied alchemical analysis, and of shadows that moved across the chamber walls long after the gaslights were snuffed. By the time the journal reached the hands of High Curator Vallatio, it had been locked in 3 boxes nested within one another, warded with runes borrowed from the cult of Verena, and bound with braided salt ropes soaked in consecrated wine. Even then, the curator insisted on reading it only by daylight, surrounded by armed guards, and within a circle of ground obsidian shards. His colleagues mocked him until they read the first 10 pages. The journal bore no title. Its cover was blackened and cracked like scorched parchment, with brass corners warped as if by immense heat. Only upon close inspection could the shape of a stylized scarab be made out, embossed into the center and flanked by what looked like Tilean characters until the letters shifted upon each viewing, rearranging themselves into other languages, ancient ones. It smelled faintly of formaldehyde and cinnamon. The first entry was dated 11th of Vino, 2501 IC. The handwriting was precise, almost obsessively neat, with a slight tremor in the serifs that suggested either age or some underlying anxiety in the author. To the curators of history, the priests of knowledge, or whatever vultures find this account, I am Professor Aurelio Kalduma of Remus, formerly of the Grand Institute of Antiquities, exiled on charges of necromantic speculation and historical heresy. This manuscript is my confession, my testament, and if the gods are just, my condemnation. Do not seek to publish these words. Bury them. Burn them. Forget me. What followed was no scholarly treatise. It was a fevered narrative, one that teetered between academic dissection and the desperate ramblings of a man pursued by horrors too vast to be comprehended. Kalduma claimed to have uncovered a reference to a forgotten Nehekharan king, Thar-Amun, the twice betrayed, whose name had been struck from every known stela, scroll, and cartouche. The only trace remained in a single scrap of vellum retrieved from a collapsed tomb east of Rasetra, where the glyphs for king, vengeance, and sealed in screaming had been partially preserved beneath layers of funeral wax and sand-crusted ichor. Fascinated by the omission, no minor feat given, Nehekharan obsession with legacy, Kalduma pieced together a map using scattered fragments of expedition logs, tomb robber confessions, and the whisperings of madmen dredged from asylum cells. All spoke of a structure buried beneath the shifting teeth, a chain of jagged sandstone ridges avoided even by the jackals. The tomb was said to devour those who came near. Entire caravans had vanished between one breath and the next, leaving only shredded tents and bloodless carcasses. Kalduma, disgraced and desperate for redemption, organized an expedition. He described in minute detail the mercenaries hired, a Riemann pistolier with a glass eye and a collection of preserved scalps, a mute Kislevite tracker with an uncanny sense of direction, a Satosan poisoner whose veins ran black with widow's kiss. He made no mention of moral character, only of their willingness to follow him into a cursed land for coin and the promise of buried gold. Their departure was made under false papers, posing as a spice-trading venture. From Remus, they traveled down to Lucini, then west along the Black Gulf, eventually landing on the desolate shores south of Zandri. From there, they vanished into the interior, leaving behind only a blood-streaked shipping manifest and a single crate addressed to the Antiquarian Guild, which would arrive years later bearing the journal itself. The further one read into the manuscript, the more fragmented Caldemar's prose became. His words blurred into fits of obsession, paranoia, and vivid recollections of phenomena that no sane man could stomach. On the 12th night, the sands moved, not merely shifted, but breathed, rising in slow exhalations that whispered against the skin. Dario swears he saw a child's hand reach from beneath the dunes before being swallowed. We lost the south cart to a sinkhole that screamed as it opened. Interspersed within the text were intricate ink drawings, skulls with elongated craniums and unnatural jawlines, ossuaries shaped like temples, and a sarcophagus covered in glyphs so dense they appeared to ripple on the page. Caldemar insisted that the tomb's architecture predated known Nehekharan dynasties, suggesting an age of kings before even Setra, when the living walked alongside gods who demanded silence instead of worship. Most chilling was a passage halfway through the manuscript, where Caldemar describes a stone stele discovered at the tomb's threshold. It bore no words, only a relief of a throne turned upside down, surrounded by a spiral of jackals devouring their own tails. Beneath it, they found bones, thousands of them, arranged in concentric circles. Many were human, some were not. We began to bleed from our gums. Fulgentius coughed teeth in his sleep, all molars. He claimed dreams of a voice like wind over broken glass, promising that we would bring the eyes back to the sun. I no longer trust my own tongue. I write in High Nehekharan without knowing the script. The final pages were stiff with salt and what appeared to be dried blood. Here, the tone collapsed into a kind of broken poetry, half-spoken invocations, warnings, and pleas. He described the opening of the sarcophagus, the scream that lasted an entire day without source or mouth, and the vision of a man cloaked in shadow whose face was a golden mask, cracked in half and weeping maggots. He referred to it only as he who was buried alive. The last legible passage read, "The king has awoken. He walks in dreams now, through time and sand, seeking those who dared steal his breath. We are ash in his lungs. We are the lie that bound him. He comes. Oh gods, he comes." The journal ends abruptly, the ink trailing off into a final jagged line across the page. Subsequent pages are blank, save for faint stains that appear only under moonlight stains that form circles and eye-like symbols with each viewing. The guild sealed the journal in their restricted vaults, labeling it as apocryphal and forbidding further access. Yet rumors abound. They say it hums when the desert winds blow in from the south. They say the stevedore who found it was found weeks later, hanging from the bell tower of Myrmidia's chapel, his eyes packed with sand and his skin mummified by some unnatural dryness. But the most persistent rumor is that of a new expedition, a group of scholars and soldiers funded by a shadowy benefactor in Miragliano, who vanished into the deserts of Nehekharan. They bore with them old maps, ancient rites, and a journal wrapped in blood-stiff sailcloth. And as the sun sets over the dunes, it is said the wind carries whispers in a tongue that has not been spoken by living lips for 5,000 years. Chapter 2. The expedition assembles. The scent of the Miragliano docks at dawn was a sour mixture of tar, brine, fish guts, and piss. Gulls screamed above like tortured spirits, wheeling over masts wrapped in fog, while stevedores cursed and dragged crates of powder and pickled meat into the gaping bellies of moored ships. Amid this chaos, cloaked in the greasy half-light of a winter morning, Professor Aurelio Caldamar made his final preparations for a journey that would earn him either glory or an unmarked grave. He wore a battered greatcoat with patches of dried salt at the cuffs and collar. Beneath it, layers of scrolls, maps, and weather-warped codices strained the seams of his satchel. His hands were ink-stained and bandaged from paper cuts, and the occasional glass shard a hazard of late-night frenzies in candle-lit archives. His eyes, once bright with the ambition of academia, now glinted with something darker. Obsession calcified into purpose. The ship was a retrofitted Tilean brigantine named Vittoria's Wager, manned by a captain who went by the name Corvani, a thin-lipped, balding man, with a spiderweb of red veins across his nose and a perpetual sneer that suggested he'd once drowned a man and hadn't found it unpleasant. Caldamar had paid him in ancient gold thalers, pressed with the face of a long-dead Araby prince. The coins had made Corvani squint but not refuse. But ships needed more than captains, they needed hands, and Caldamar had assembled his from the gutters and graveyards of the old world. The first was Diogo Varnese, a disavowed Rayman duelist with a reputation for killing clients who delayed payment. He wore 9 rings, each made from the jawbone of someone he'd killed. His saber was a Kemrian relic, blackened from use and supposedly cursed. He called it Whispers. It had a handle wrapped in human hair and a faint pulse when gripped. He had no faith in gods or hierarchies, only blades and instincts. Next came Ezora Malfi, a scholar priestess from the Collegium Occultum in Tobaro, expelled for performing dissections without permission and often without anesthetic. Her eyes were milk-white from years reading texts by candlelight, but her mind was razored steel. She carried her books in a lacquered case made from lacquered ghoulbone and spoke in a low murmur as if every sentence was a spell barely restrained. Gorek, the Pale, was a brute of indeterminate origin, likely Nordland or further north, who bore tattoos of old sea gods and the brand of a slaver on his neck. He'd been found in a Miragliano fighting pit, chained, gnawing on the ear of a rival. They said he didn't sleep, only leaned against the hull and stared into the water as if waiting for something to rise. Brother Salvek, a wandering mendicant of Moor, joined uninvited. No one remembered hiring him. He appeared on the dock in moth-eaten robes, a brass skull amulet thumping against his chest, reeking of myrrh and ash. When Caldamar asked his purpose, Salvek simply replied, "To bear witness, the dead will be plentiful." He brought nothing but a rusted censer and a shovel, and then there were the others' hired blades, hired fools, gutter thieves, relic peddlers, 2 Altdorf men who claimed to be archaeologists but spoke more like grave robbers. In total, Caldamar counted 24 souls, not including crew. Most were nameless to him, and he preferred it that way. Fewer names to remember when the screams began. The Vittoria's Wager left port with little fanfare. Fog swallowed her silhouette before the harbor bells stopped ringing. The wind was foul, full of crows and omen-laced mutterings. Ezora claimed the clouds resembled coiled serpents. Salvek whispered prayers. Diogo sharpened his saber. Below deck, Caldamar laid out the map, a tapestry of stitched vellum and human skin, The map was blasphemous even to glance at. Inked with crushed lapis and spider bile, it depicted a region south of Zandri known only as the Shifting Teeth, jagged ridgelines and deathless sands, said to swallow whole armies. At the heart of this desolation was a glyph, not a name, not a symbol, just a scarab carved in crimson and flanked by spiral notations. Kaldemar traced it with a gloved finger. "Thar-Amun," he whispered, almost reverently. Izora narrowed her cloudy eyes. "You place great faith in myth, Professor. I place faith in what has been hidden. And this tomb was buried from history, buried with purpose." "Or fantasy," she said flatly. Kaldemar smiled, a dry, mirthless smile. "Even fantasy casts a shadow, Izora, and I intend to walk beneath it." The voyage took 18 days. Storms harried them. Food spoiled quicker than it should have. Twice, crewmen vanished during the night shift. One was found in the bilge, with his tongue chewed off, and the symbol of a flayed jackal carved into his chest. Brother Salve claimed it was a warning from the Nehekharan gods. "False idols don't scare me," Diogo muttered, dabbing salt on his blade's edge. But they scared the crew. Morale turned sour. Whispers thickened. Men took to sleeping in groups, back to back, armed. Izora's books began twitching in her chest, reacting to something neither sun nor sea could explain. "And through it all," Kaldemar wrote, pages upon pages in a new leather-bound journal, transcribing dreams he didn't remember having, columns of hieroglyphs he shouldn't understand, poems of death, and invocations for waking the king beyond sand. He began speaking Nehekharan in his sleep. Izora noted his pupils no longer dilated correctly. Landfall came not as triumph, but as quiet relief. The coastline stretched jagged and skeletal, dotted with ruined obelisks and half-buried idols. The air reeked of old copper and myrrh burned centuries ago. Corvani refused to stay longer than 3 days. "After that," he said, "you're either ghosts or gold." He grinned with the same expression a man gives to lepers. Kaldemar nodded. "We'll be gone before the 4th sunrise." The moment boots hit sand, the desert shifted. Not physically, but viscerally. The air seemed heavier. Dry, yes, but wrong, like breathing in ash and memory. The dunes ahead were strangely geometric, symmetrical in a way that suggested design over nature. Black shapes flitted between them, too distant to identify. The heat was oppressive, despite the clouded sky. They began the march inland. 3 hours in, one of the mercenaries stepped on what looked like a stone marker. It hissed. A dart embedded itself in his neck. He was dead in seconds, skin bubbled, eyes boiled. Gorek laughed. First blood. Brother Salvek buried the corpse with his shovel, drawing a skull in the sand. "More take you. You'll not be the last." By nightfall, they'd reached the edge of the Shifting Teeth, ridge after ridge of shattered sandstone, sharp enough to cut through boots. The stars above were unfamiliar, strange constellations twisted into cruel shapes. Some claimed they moved. One man tried to chart them and was found hanging from a dead tree at dawn, eyes missing, smile carved ear to ear. Izora warned that the land was feeding on them. This place has no hunger for gold. It wants memory, blood, legacy. Kaldemar was unmoved. He slept with the map under his head and whispered to it like a lover. The final count of the expedition was now 21. The rest would not be remembered. On the 3rd night, Izora woke Kaldemar. "There's something moving." He rose, heart pounding. The desert was silent, but listening. He stepped from the tent and there, outlined by moonlight, stood a statue. It hadn't been there before. Tall, jackal-headed, its arms were crossed, bearing blades of obsidian and bronze. A Nehekharan king's guardian. It moved, Azora said, voice tight. As they watched, the statue's shadow shifted, not from the moon, but of its own accord. A whisper, not of wind, passed them, and in the sand beneath their feet, something stirred. Kaldemar felt the first tingle of fear then. The expedition had assembled. The sands had welcomed them. The tomb was waiting. Chapter 3. Upon desert shores, Zandri rose from the sand like a corpse clawing its way free from a premature burial, ruined, half devoured by time, and stinking of death. The Vittoria's wager anchored 2 miles off its shattered harbor, unwilling to moor closer lest its keel strike the bones of sunken warships long since claimed by the black tide. The desert wind howled across the water, lifting veils of heat from the dunes like the breath of a dying god. Salt and decay fused in the air, and even the gulls refused to circle. They came ashore in long boats, their silhouettes dark against the ochre dawn. Kaldemar stood at the prow, coat snapping in the wind, journal clutched to his chest as if it might shield him from the ancient judgment that seemed to radiate from the ruins. Around him, mercenaries scanned the crumbling skyline of Zandri with wary eyes, hands resting on hilts and triggers. Azora clutched her book satchel like a relic chest, her lips moving in quiet, constant translation of whatever mumbled tongue she heard in her head. The ruined city loomed ahead, columns cracked and half-submerged in sand, streets choked with jagged masonry, and statues of forgotten pharaohs toppled like fallen gods. The harbor's remains jutted out from the surf like rotted teeth, and the great lighthouse, a monolith once said to shine brighter than any flame, was reduced to a shattered stump encrusted with salt and bird shit. Brother Salvek knelt in the sand and pressed his forehead to the earth. "They burned their dead here once," he murmured, "before the priests turned them into monuments, before the gods demanded their flesh endure." Kaldemar ignored him. His eyes were fixed on the crumbling horizon beyond Zandri, where the dunes shifted like restless bodies beneath funeral shrouds. They were met on the shore by a figure wrapped in a patchwork robe of scavenged silks and blackened leather. His face was obscured by layers of linen stained brown with old blood, and his eyes, wet, bulbous things, bulged behind green-tinted goggles. He walked with a limp and the quiet menace of a man who had outlived better men through cruelty and cunning alone. "This is Chaf," Korvani had said back on the ship. "Local, speaks the old tongue, knows the teeth. You'll need him." Kaf spoke little, and when he did, it was in a rasp like a sandstorm through bone. He carried a staff of black wood, adorned with the skulls of small animals and tarnished amulets that clinked softly as he walked. When asked his price, he held up 3 fingers. "3 names," he said. "You will know them before the desert ends." The expedition moved inland before the sun reached its apex, dragging carts laden with supplies, water barrels wrapped in waxed cloth, bundles of canvas tents, alchemical instruments sealed in iron cases, and a long, coffin-shaped crate wrapped in chains. No one but Azora and Kaldemar knew what it contained. Gorek volunteered to guard it, grinning like a wolf. The heat was a living thing, pressing down on them like the hand of a furious god. Boots sank into sand that sizzled through leather. Flies, fat and glutted with unseen carrion, buzzed in clouds that never dissipated. Time unraveled under the sun's lash. Hours became slurred, skin peeled, lips cracked. By midday, 2 of the hired men had passed out. One never woke. Salvek murmured rites over his body and left him to the vultures. Kaf guided them with unnatural certainty, tracing lines in the sand with his staff and muttering to himself in a dialect none could name. When asked how he knew the path, he only replied, "The desert remembers." They passed the skeletal remains of an ancient aqueduct, its arches shattered and leaning like broken vertebrae. Beyond it lay a necropolis, rows upon rows of stone tombs, half buried in the dunes, their entrances sealed with tar and copper. Diogo paused to inspect a doorway. "Sealed from the outside," he noted. "To keep something in, not out." Izora pressed her fingers to the stone. "Do you hear it?" "I hear nothing," he said. "Exactly," she whispered. "That's what worries me." Kaldemar pressed onward, deeper into the dunes. The map itched in his coat, as if it wanted to leap from his pocket and crawl ahead. He could feel it now, like a compass needle spinning madly. The tomb of Thar-Amun was near. Each step felt heavier, as if something ancient and buried strained against the earth beneath them. The second night brought winds thick with grit and whispering voices. Tents flapped like wings. Men dreamed of laughter in a tongue they did not understand. One woke screaming, blind, his eyes replaced by wriggling beetles. Another vanished entirely, his bedroll left behind as if he'd simply evaporated. Kaf said nothing, only drew symbols in the sand around the camp and spat between them. Izora caught him muttering an old funerary incantation, his voice rising and falling like a chant from the tomb priest orders. "You're frightened," she said. Kaf's goggles glinted. "I was born frightened." By the fourth day, the desert had stripped them raw. Blisters burst. Lips bled. One man, desperate with thirst, attempted to drink from a pool of water shimmering on the horizon. It was a mirage. He broke his nose, running headfirst into a rock. Gorek laughed until Kaldemar silenced him with a look. Then they saw their monoliths, huge black stones thrust into the earth like titanic grave markers. Each bore carvings worn to smoothness by wind and time. Kaldemar approached the first and brushed sand from its face. The glyphs shimmered, then reformed under his fingers. "They move," he whispered. Izora nodded. "Runes of denial. The dead wrote them when they did not wish to be found." Diogo drew his saber. "Which means we're close." That night they camped near the stones. The wind carried scents of old incense and rotting myrrh. Shapes moved at the edge of firelight, too small to be men, too large to be rats. No one slept. Salvek burned black lotus in his censer, choking the air with bitter smoke. Men coughed blood and muttered prayers. Kaldemar did not sleep. He watched the stars shift in ways they shouldn't, constellations spinning into new shapes, jackals eating hearts, scarabs crawling from skulls. Izora approached him. "This is more than you claimed. You knew what waited here." "I suspected," he said, not looking away from the sky. "Now I know." "Then what is it?" Kaldemar's mouth was dry, but the words came like prophecy. "A prison, a tomb, a warning. All three. Thar-Amun was not buried to honor him. He was buried to contain him." She stared at him. "And you intend to unseal it?" "I intend to understand it. Understanding doesn't raise cities, Kaldemar. It raises them." He didn't answer. At dawn, Kaf led them to a plateau, carved into the shape of an open palm. In the center was a pit perfectly round, impossibly black. Around it were pillars, inscribed with prayers for blindness and silence. Izora translated them with trembling hands. "This is it," she said. "The gateway." Kaldemar approached the pit. The air around it pulsed hot and dry and wrong. The wind ceased. Beneath the sands, something shifted. The tomb of Thar-Amun waited, and it had heard them coming. Chapter 4. Whispers in the sand. The desert changed once they passed beyond the plateau. It was not an immediate transformation, no sudden storm or dramatic rupture of earth, but a subtler, more malignant shift, like the slow onset of a fever. The air grew thicker, pressing against the lungs with every breath. Sound behaved strangely. Footsteps sometimes echoed where no stone lay, while shouted orders were swallowed whole, vanishing a few yards from the speaker's mouth. Even the wind no longer blew in a single direction. It circled them, whispering, sighing, sometimes laughing. Kaf stopped marking the sand. "This far," he rasped, planting his staff with finality. "The desert walks alone." Kaldemar demanded he continue. Gold was offered. Threats followed. Kaf only shook his head, goggles reflecting the pale glare of the sun like a corpse's eyes. "Beyond this," he said, "the sand listens, and it repeats what it hears." He would guide them no further. Gorek suggested killing him and taking his water. Ezora's stare stopped that notion cold. Kaf departed at dusk, limping back toward Zandri without a backward glance. Before he left, he spoke 3 names into the sand. None of the expedition recognized them. All would remember them later. The first ghost lights appeared that night. They rose from the dunes like sickly stars fallen to earth, pale blue, green, sometimes violet, hovering just above the sand. They pulsed softly, rhythmically, as if breathing. At first, the mercenaries mistook them for lanterns or reflections from distant camps. Then they began to move. One drifted close to the perimeter of the camp, bobbing gently. Its light illuminated the face of a young scout named Matteo, barely more than a boy, with a crossbow too big for his shoulders and a nervous habit of humming when afraid. The light hovered inches from his face, casting his shadow backward in grotesque proportions. "Do you see that?" Matteo asked. Before anyone could answer, the light split into 3, then 7, then dozens, spreading across the dunes like a plague of will-o'-wisps. The sand beneath them began to glow faintly, revealing shapes beneath bones, half-buried skulls, rib cages locked together like lovers. Ezora shouted for everyone to stay still. Matteo didn't. He took 1 step forward, then another, eyes glassy, humming louder. The lights retreated slowly, teasingly, drawing him away from the camp. Diogo moved to grab him, but Gorek caught his arm. "Let him go," the brute said softly. "Something's chosen him." Matteo vanished into the dunes, swallowed by light and shadow. His humming lingered for several seconds after his form was gone, growing thinner, higher, until it ended in a wet, choking sound. They never found his body. By morning, his footprints ended abruptly, as if he'd been lifted straight into the air. The sand beneath them was fused into glass. Sleep became an enemy. Those who managed it woke screaming, clawing at their faces, eyes wide with terror. The dreams were vivid beyond reason, more real than waking life. Men dreamed of walking through endless halls of stone, lined with statues that turned their heads as they passed. They dreamed of being flayed and wrapped in linen while still breathing. They dreamed of a throne buried upside down in sand, beneath which something vast and furious beat against its prison. Kaldemar dreamed the most. He stood beneath a sun that burned black, staring at a city made entirely of bone. A figure approached him, tall, regal, wrapped in gold and shadow. Its face was hidden behind a funerary mask cracked down the center. From the fissure spilled beetles, teeth, and human fingers. You walk on my breath, the figure said. You carry my name like a theft. Kaldamar woke each time with blood running from his nose and hieroglyphs etched into his skin, shallow but unmistakable. Azora scrubbed them away with alcohol and salt, but they returned by the next dawn. Brother Salvek claimed the dreams were invitations. The dead do not knock, he said, swinging his censer. They beckon. Mirages plagued them by day. Water shimmered ahead, clear pools ringed by palm trees heavy with fruit. When men ran toward them, the images dissolved into salt flats and cracked stone. Once, they saw an entire city on the horizon, gleaming white and gold, banners fluttering. Diogo swore he heard music. Azora spat into the sand. Lies, she said. The desert remembers what was and shows it to what is, but one mirage did not fade. On the seventh day, they crested a dune and saw a caravan ahead, wagons, camels, banners of faded Tilean red. The men were laughing, cooking, alive, one of the mercenaries shouted, voice cracking with relief. Kaldamar froze. He recognized the caravan. It was his own down to the placement of crates, the torn canvas on the third wagon, the blood stain on the sand where the first man had died days earlier. They were looking at themselves. The mirage. Kaldamar turned, eyes empty, and raised a hand in greeting. Azora screamed. The vision collapsed in on itself, sucked downward as if the sand had opened its mouth. Where it had stood was a pit filled with gnawed bones and rusted equipment, old, ancient, unmistakably Tilean. No one spoke for hours after that. Violence followed. On the 10th night, one of the old dwarf scholars attacked Gorek with a hammer, screaming that the brute's shadow was wrong. Gorek tore his throat out with his teeth. Another man put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger without a word. Salvek buried the pieces and marked the graves with inverted skulls. Food spoiled overnight. Water skins cracked. One barrel burst, its contents turning black and oily. Azora tested it and recoiled. It's blood, she whispered. Old blood. The ghost lights returned nightly now, circling just beyond the firelight. Sometimes shapes moved within them, faces stretched in silent screams, hands reaching, grasping. Once, a light brushed Brother Salvek's censer. The flame went out. Salvek did not relight it. I have seen this place before, he said quietly. In Moor's gardens, in the fields where souls wait to be weighed. This land is a grave that refuses to stay closed. The sand began to whisper names. At first, it was faint, just at the edge of hearing. Men thought it was wind or madness, but soon the whispers grew clearer. Voices called out in familiar tones. Mothers, lovers, old comrades. Promises were made, apologies offered, regrets voiced. Diogo heard the voice of a woman he'd killed years ago in a duel gone wrong. She begged him to look at her. Azora heard her mentor, long dead, urging her to finish the translation. Kaldamar heard applause. He wrote frantically, hands shaking, ink blotting the pages. The map pulsed beneath his fingers, its scarab symbol glowing faintly at night. He no longer denied it. Something beneath the sand was awake, and it was learning them. The scout's disappearance was only the first. On the 12th night, the watch changed. When the relief came, 2 men were gone. No signs of struggle, no blood. Their armor lay neatly arranged beside the fire, helms placed atop breastplates as if prepared for burial. In the sand nearby, someone or something had written a single Nehekharan glyph using crushed bone. Azora translated it at dawn. Repayment. Kaldamar closed his journal and stared east, where the dunes rose like a frozen sea. We are no longer trespassers, he said hoarsely. We are offerings, the sand whispered louder, and beneath it, far below, something vast shifted its weight, impatient for the hands that would finally unseal its tomb. Chapter 5. The Tomb Revealed. The storm did not arrive with thunder. It came as a whisper first, a low, crawling sigh that threaded through the dunes and slipped beneath armor, beneath skin, beneath thought. The sky dimmed as if smeared with ash, the sun reduced to a pale, diseased disk. Sand began to move sideways, then upward, then everywhere, flaying exposed flesh raw within minutes. Cloaks snapped like wounded birds. Men dropped to their knees, coughing blood and grit, eyes streaming. Kaf's absence was felt keenly now. There was no guide to read the wind, no ritual to ward it off. The desert had chosen its moment. "Cover your mouths," Diogo shouted, wrapping a scarf around his face. "Anchor the carts." Too late. A gust, like a giant's breath, tore through the camp, ripping tents free and flinging them into the void. One mercenary was lifted bodily from the ground and smashed against a rock outcrop hard enough that his bones burst through his skin. Another vanished screaming into the wall of sand, his voice cut short with a wet crunch. Kaldemar clutched his satchel and journal, crawling toward the nearest stone spur as the storm howled like a choir of the damned. The wind screamed words now not imagined, not half heard, but clear. "Unseal. Remember? Come below." Azora dragged herself beside him, her face wrapped in linen already soaked red. "This isn't natural," she screamed. "This storm, it's excavating." She was right. The sand did not merely scour. It peeled away layers of earth with deliberate precision, carving channels, exposing bedrock. Dunes collapsed inward, collapsing into unseen voids. The ground trembled not violently, but rhythmically, like the slow pulse of something waking. Then the wind ceased. Silence fell so abruptly it hurt. Before them, where there had been nothing but featureless sand, stood a wall of black stone taller than a cathedral nave. It was impossibly smooth, unmarred by erosion, its surface drinking in the light rather than reflecting it. The entrance was vast, a rectangular aperture framed by towering pylons carved from obsidian-veined basalt, each etched with reliefs so deep and precise they seemed freshly cut. The tomb of Thar-Amun had been revealed. Men stared in mute horror. Even Gorik's grin faltered. The entrance was sealed by a massive stone door, cracked down the center. Chains of green bronze lay snapped and half-buried at its base, links thicker than a man's thigh, their ends twisted as if torn apart by colossal strength from within. Azora approached first, her scholarly instinct overriding fear. She brushed sand from the nearest relief. It depicted a king seated upon a throne, not upright, but bound. His arms were pinned behind his back by priests wielding hooked staves. His crown lay shattered at his feet. His mouth was open in a scream, and from it poured tiny carved figures, men, women, children being devoured by jackals with human eyes. "This isn't a burial," Azora whispered. "It's an execution." Kaldemar felt his pulse in his throat. He stepped closer, ignoring the sting of sand in his wounds. The reliefs continued along the pylons, telling a story in stone. The king Thar-Amun was shown leading armies, conquering cities, crowned by gods whose faces had been scratched away. Then came the betrayal. Priests plunging blades into his back, courtiers averting their eyes, a populace kneeling in terror. The final panels showed the king entombed alive, sealed beneath the earth while still struggling, still aware. The last carving was the most disturbing of all. It showed the king's eyes open, watching. "They buried him breathing," Brother Salvik said hoarsely. "By more, they buried him awake." A low sound rolled from the tomb, then not quite a voice, not quite a vibration. The stone beneath their feet shuddered. Dust drifted from the pylons like falling ash. Some of the men backed away immediately. "No," one of the mercenaries stammered. "No gold is worth this. This is wrong. This is cursed." Another fell to his knees, retching, bile streaking his beard. "We should turn back. Seal it again. We shouldn't be here." Diogo looked between the tomb and Kaldemar, jaw tight. "They're right," he said quietly. "This isn't plunder. It's a grave meant to stay closed." Kaldemar did not answer at first. He was staring at the crack in the door. Something within it moved. Not visibly, not yet, but suggestively. A sense of pressure built behind the stone, like breath drawn into vast lungs. The air grew warm, then hot. A scent seeped out. Old spices, rot, embalming resin, and something metallic and fresh beneath it all. Blood. "We turn back now," Azora said, gripping his sleeve. "We leave. We erase this place from memory. Whatever lies inside is history," Kaldemar interrupted, voice trembling with fervor. "Erased history, deliberately. This king was not merely overthrown, he was unmade, his name scoured, his monuments buried, his memory poisoned. That was done for a reason." "Yes," Kaldemar hissed, "because he terrified them." The ground shook again, stronger this time. A hairline fracture crept along the door, widening with a sound like bones grinding together. A trickle of black dust spilled out, forming symbols as it pooled. Izora recognized them and went pale. "Those are binding glyphs," she said, "and they're failing." Brother Salvek raised his censer, swinging it hard. "Then let them fail without us present. Professor, listen to me. The dead do not forgive desecration. They remember it." Kaldemar rounded on him, eyes wild. "You speak of forgiveness like a priest. I speak of truth. Do you know what this could mean? A lost dynasty, pre-Setran rulership. A king powerful enough that even the gods feared his return. Or a tyrant so monstrous that death itself refused him release." Azora shot back. Silence fell between them, heavy as the stone above. One of the men, young, shaking, ran. He made it 3 steps before the sand beneath him collapsed. A sinkhole opened silently, swallowing him whole. His scream echoed briefly from below, then cut off as something snapped his spine like a twig. The pit closed moments later, smooth and undisturbed. No one moved after that. Kaldemar turned back to the tomb. "We go on," he said. "Not for gold, not even for knowledge, but because this place demands to be witnessed." "You're condemning us," Diogo said. "No," Kaldemar replied softly. "I'm acknowledging that we were condemned the moment we crossed the dunes." Oh, another tremor ran through the ground. The crack in the door widened further, and from the darkness beyond came a sound unmistakable and horrifyingly human. A breath, long, ragged, ancient. Izora closed her eyes. "Then there's no stopping you." "No," Kaldemar agreed. He stepped forward, placing his palm against the cold black stone. The moment he touched it, pain lanced up his arm, and images flooded his mind. Betrayal, chains, screaming priests, endless centuries of suffocating dark. He cried out but did not pull away. The stone responded. With a sound like a mountain breaking its back, the door shuddered. Dust and fragments rained down. The crack widened into a gap large enough to admit a man. From within rolled a wave of fetid air, thick with decay and power. The tomb of Thar-Amun stood open, and somewhere deep below, something smiled. Chapter 6. Trespassers Below. The darkness inside the tomb was not the honest absence of light. It was active, a thickness that pressed against the eyes, swallowing torchlight until flames guttered low and sickly, casting shadows that lagged behind their owners like reluctant reflections. The air was hot and stale, layered with centuries of embalming resins, dust ground from bone, and something coppery that clung to the tongue. Each breath tasted like rot preserved in honey. Kaldemar crossed the threshold first. The moment his boots struck the stone floor, a tremor rippled through the corridor, subtle but unmistakable. The torches flared, then steadied, their flames bending inward as if drawn toward the depths ahead. Behind him, the others followed in grim silence, Diogo with blade drawn, Izora murmuring warding phrases under her breath, Gorek dragging the chained crate with a grunt of effort, Brother Salvek counting steps in a low monotone like a man preparing a grave. The door groaned behind them. No one turned to look when it sealed. The passage descended at a shallow angle, its walls carved from the same black stone as the entrance, but polished to a glassy sheen. Murals stretched along both sides, illuminated in jerks and flashes as torchlight passed over them. The carvings were impossibly detailed, each figure rendered with such depth that veins stood out beneath stone flesh, eyes carved with such precision they seemed wet. Izora stopped before the first panel, her breath hitching. It depicted Thar-Amun in his prime, tall, broad-shouldered, crowned in gold and lapis, his hands raised not in prayer but command. Armies knelt before him, Nehekharan warriors, beast-headed constructs, even figures that did not resemble men at all. Above him hovered gods or spirits, their forms half erased, faces chiseled away in deliberate defacement. "They've been struck out," Izora whispered, "every divine patron scrubbed from record." Kaldemar traced the outline of one ruined figure with reverent fingers. "He ruled without their consent," he said, "or worse, against it." Further along, the murals darkened. The next sequence showed a great hall filled with priests and nobles. Their smiles were thin. Daggers gleamed behind ceremonial robes. Thar-Amun stood at the center, unarmed, his crown absent. The stone captured the moment of betrayal with cruel clarity, the first blade piercing his side, his expression not of pain but of disbelief. The corridor narrowed. Here, the carvings grew violent, priests dragging the king through blood-slick corridors, hooks piercing flesh, chains biting into wrists and ankles. Thar-Amun screaming, his mouth stretched impossibly wide, eyes bulging as spells burned sigils into his skin. Brother Salvek retched and turned away. "This is blasphemy beyond blasphemy." "No," Kaldemar said softly, eyes alight. "This is fear." The floor beneath them pulsed then, once, twice like a massive heartbeat. Dust trickled from the ceiling. Somewhere deep below, stone scraped against stone. They pressed on. The corridor opened into a vast antechamber supported by towering columns carved in the shape of bound kings, each one unique, each bearing a crown broken in a different way. The ceiling was lost in darkness. Their footsteps echoed endlessly, distorted, returning half a second too late. At the center of the chamber stood a plinth of gold-veined obsidian. Upon it rested an ankh. It was large, too large to be ceremonial, crafted from solid gold, etched with glyphs that shimmered faintly even in torchlight. Its surface was warm to the touch, radiating a low, steady glow like embers buried beneath ash. The symbol pulsed in time with the tomb's heartbeat. Kaldemar stopped breathing. Izora saw it immediately, the way his posture changed, the slack reverence in his face. "Don't," she said sharply. "That's a focus, a phylactery or Kaldumar stepped closer. The glow intensified, bathing his face in molten gold. Shadows recoiled from it. The air vibrated, and whispers filled the chamber, dozens of overlapping voices speaking Nehekharan, Old Tilean, tongues older than both. Bearer, witness, return what was taken. Kaldumar reached out. Izora grabbed his arm. Professor, you don't know what. The ankh flared. Azora screamed as a shockwave hurled her backward. Torches extinguished instantly, plunging the chamber into darkness, broken only by the ankh's glow. Men shouted. Gorek cursed. Stone cracked overhead. Kaldumar stood rigid, fingers inches from the artifact, eyes unfocused. The glyphs on the ankh rearranged themselves, aligning into a single phrase Izora recognized with horror. Heart of the King. Necromantic energy flooded the chamber. The air grew heavy, thick with death magic so dense it prickled the skin. The murals along the walls moved. Figures twitched, eyes rolled, mouths opened in silent screams. One priest carved into the wall tore free, falling to the floor in a cascade of stone fragments, its hollow eyes burning green before crumbling to dust. Brother Salvek shouted prayers to more, his voice shaking. This place is a wound. We are standing inside a corpse that refuses to rot. The floor split. From the cracks seeped black mist, cold and stinking of graves. Skeletal hands burst forth, clawing blindly. One mercenary was dragged screaming into the earth, his armor peeling away as unseen forces flensed him alive. Another fired wildly into the darkness before something slammed him against a pillar hard enough to turn his spine to powder. Diogo fought like a madman, saber flashing, severing hands, hacking at shapes forming in the mist. Kaldumar! He roared. Whatever you've done, undo it! Kaldumar did not hear him. The ankh whispered to him alone now. He saw visions, cities burning beneath black suns, priests screaming as chains dragged them into darkness, endless centuries of suffocating stillness. He felt Thar-Amun's rage, vast and cold, layered with patience honed by millennia of burial. They stole my breath, the voice thundered within him. You carry it back to me. Kaldumar's fingers closed around the ankh. The tomb screamed. Every wall vibrated. The columns cracked, shedding shards of stone like flensed skin. The heartbeat became a thunderous drum. The necromantic energy surged outward, slamming the survivors to the ground. Ezora tasted blood and sand as she crawled toward Kaldumar, her vision swimming. Let it go, she screamed. You're not chosen, you're being used. Kaldumar turned slowly. His eyes glowed gold. You don't understand, he said, voice layered with another beneath it. This is not theft. This is restoration. Behind him, deeper in the tomb, something massive shifted. A distant door slammed open. Chains snapped. A sound like 1,000 coffins opening at once rolled through the stone. The ankh burned brighter, searing Kaldumar's flesh. He did not cry out. Brother Salvek staggered to his feet, censer swinging wildly. We are trespassers, he shouted, and trespassers are punished. As if in answer, the shadows along the walls peeled away, forming into tall, skeletal figures clad in fragments of ancient armor. Their eyes burned with cold green fire. They raised rusted blades in perfect unison. The dead had awoken. The tomb had accepted their presence, and it would not let them leave unchanged. Chapter 7. The curse awakens. They did not flee. That was the first, greatest sin. The chamber lay in ruin, around them cracked pillars bleeding dust, shattered reliefs twitching as Residual necromancy crawled through the stone like insects beneath skin. The skeletal sentinels had withdrawn after their brief, brutal manifestation, collapsing into piles of inert bone and corroded bronze, as if satisfied that the warning had been delivered. The silence that followed was worse than the violence. It pressed down on the ears until every breath sounded obscene. Kaldemar stood at the center of it all, the golden ankh clenched in his burned hands, its glow dimmed but steady, like a coal buried in ash. His fingers were blistered black, flesh fused to the metal, yet he showed no sign of pain. His breathing was slow, reverent, his eyes distant as though part of him were already elsewhere. Izora watched him with naked dread. "This place is active," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "We should take only what we must. Light, fast, and then we leave. The longer we remain, the longer we are observed," Diogo finished grimly. "But greed, once loosed, does not return to its cage." The mercenaries spread out, prying gemstones from the eyes of fallen statues, hacking gilded funerary masks from walls, stuffing relics into packs already heavy with stolen history. Gorek tore a bronze arm from one of the bound king columns, laughing as it crashed to the floor. The sound echoed, multiplied, returned from corridors that should not have existed. Brother Salvek moved among them, censer swinging, muttering prayers that sounded increasingly like apologies. "You plucked teeth from a skull that still remembers how to bite," he warned. No one listened. They pressed deeper. The corridors beyond the antechamber twisted unnaturally, geometry bending in ways that made Izora's eyes ache. Passageways sloped upward only to lead downward again. Corners looped back on themselves. Torches flickered with green-edged flames that cast shadows independent of the bodies that bore them. Statues lined the halls, hundreds of them. Warriors, priests, courtiers, servants, all carved in lifelike poses, faces frozen in expressions of terror, awe, or obedience. Some were half-formed, as if caught mid-transformation. Stone linen clung to stone flesh with obscene intimacy. Every pair of eyes was inlaid with obsidian or onyx, polished to a mirror sheen. Ezura felt it first. "They're moving," she whispered. "No," Diogo said, though his grip tightened on his saber. Ezora forced herself to look away from the nearest statue, a jackal-headed guardian holding a halberd across its chest. She took 3 steps down the corridor, then glanced back. The halberd had shifted. Barely. An inch, perhaps, but unmistakably angled toward her. "They only move when not watched," she said, voice breaking. "The magic animates them through perception. Observation arrests the spell." Gorek barked a laugh. "Then keep your eyes open." The corridor curved, and suddenly there were too many statues to watch at once. A scream echoed from behind them. They found the mercenary slumped against the wall, armor intact, skin pale and waxy. His eyes were open, but entirely black, as if filled with ink. His mouth gaped wide, tongue shriveled and gray. There was no blood on the floor. Ezora knelt, hands trembling as she examined the corpse. "Drained," she whispered. "Not consumed. Taken." "By what?" someone demanded. The answer came unbidden. A statue behind them cracked. Stone split down the spine of a priestly figure, chunks sloughing off to reveal desiccated flesh beneath. The corpse stepped free of its stone shell with a wet, grinding sound, linen wrappings fluttering as if caught in a wind that did not exist. Its eyes burned green, its mouth stretched in a rictus grin. Diogo was on it in an instant, saber flashing. The blade sheared through the mummy's neck, but the head did not fall. It shrieked a sound like air forced through a coffin crack and clawed at him blindly. Gorek crushed it with a hammer blow that shattered skull and spine alike. The body collapsed, did not rise again. But from deeper within the tomb came the answering sound of stone breaking free. One crack, then another, then dozens. "They're waking," Salvek said softly. "Not all at once, not yet. But the curse is awake now. It has smelled us." Kaldemar said nothing. He stood apart from the chaos, head tilted as if listening to a distant melody. The Ankh pulsed faintly in his grasp, each beat answered by a tremor beneath their feet. They reached the Hall of Kings at what felt like the heart of the tomb. It was vast beyond reason, a cavern carved from bedrock and lined with sarcophagi stacked 3 high along the walls. Each coffin was sealed with gold and pitch, engraved with names scratched nearly into oblivion. Many had been defaced, cartouches chiseled out, faces gouged away. The air here was thick with power, heavy enough to bow the spine. At the far end of the hall stood a raised dais. Upon it rested a single sarcophagus, larger than the others, carved from obsidian and gold-veined stone. Its lid bore the likeness of Thar-Amun himself, crowned, serene, hands crossed over his chest in mock repose. Chains wrapped the coffin in ritual knots, each link inscribed with words that flickered weakly, their magic eroded by time and theft. Ezora knew without reading the glyphs. "This is him." The floor shuddered as if in answer. One of the mercenaries, a bald man with a face like a butcher's block, stepped forward, eyes shining. "Think of the gold," he breathed. The relics, a statue behind him moved. Its stone blade punched through his back and out his chest in a spray of blood and bone. He died without a sound, mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. The hall erupted into violence. Statues shed stone skins and attacked, their movements jerky but relentless. Mummies tore free from lesser coffins, claws scraping, teeth gnashing. Diogo carved a bloody arc through them, saber slick and singing. Gorek roared as he fought, bones cracking beneath his fists. Salvek's censer flared with sickly light as he shouted prayers that burned holes through undead flesh. Ezora ducked beneath a swinging halberd and slammed a warding sigil onto a mummy's chest. It screamed and burst into dust, its curse dispersing like ash. And through it all, the great sarcophagus creaked. A sound like stone dragged across stone echoed through the hall. The chains tightened, then snapped, one by one. The links shattered, exploding outward with enough force to pulp a man where he stood. The wards flared brightly for a heartbeat, then guttered out like candles in a storm. Kaldemar stepped forward, transfixed. "No!" Ezora screamed. "Get away from it!" The lid shifted. A hand emerged from the darkness within skeletal, wrapped in tattered gold-threaded linen. Fingers flexed slowly, deliberately. Dust poured from the coffin like breath exhaled after centuries held. The lid slid aside with a thunderous crash. Thar-Amun rose. He was taller than any man, his frame gaunt but regal, flesh preserved unnaturally, stretched tight over bone. His crown was cracked, its jewels dull with age. His eyes burned with a cold, furious light that scoured the soul. When he moved, the air screamed. He looked upon them and smiled. The undead halted, frozen in reverence. Even the statues stilled. Thar-Amun's gaze fell upon Kaldemar and the Ankh in his hands. Recognition flared. "You carry my heart," the king said, his voice echoing inside their skulls rather than the hall. "You have walked my breath and bled my memory." He stepped down from the dais. Each footfall shook the chamber. "I rise," Thar-Amun intoned, to reclaim what was stolen. The curse had fully awakened, and the tomb, long silent, rejoiced in blood. Chapter 8. The Return of Thar-Amun. The Hall of Kings fell into a silence so profound it felt like suffocation. Dust hung frozen in the air, suspended as if time itself had flinched. The undead host mummies, animated statues, skeletal sentinels stood utterly still, heads bowed in reverence. Even the torches refused to flicker. Their flames stretched long and thin, bent toward the towering figure that had risen from the sarcophagus. Thar-Amun stood fully revealed. He was not a mindless corpse dragged back by crude necromancy. He was will-given flesh again, hatred wearing the shape of a king. His body was preserved with obscene care, skin stretched tight and lacquered with ancient resins, veins etched in gold leaf that pulsed faintly with unholy light. His crown sat crooked upon his skull, cracked down the center, the gemstones dulled but intact, symbols of authority denied but never relinquished. Linen wrappings trailed from his limbs like the remnants of burial shrouds torn away in rage. When he breathed, the tomb answered. Stone groaned. The floor shuddered. Somewhere deep below, chambers long sealed began to open, locks failing under the pressure of his awakening. Every soul present felt it, a crushing weight in the chest, a command that demanded kneeling. Several men obeyed without realizing it. Their knees struck stone with a sound like cracking bone. Kaldemar remained standing. The ankh burned in his hands now, no longer merely warm but searing. The gold fused irrevocably to his flesh. He should have screamed. Instead, he stared in rapture. "My king," he whispered. Thar-Amun's gaze swept the hall, slow and deliberate. Each living man it touched felt flayed from the inside, memories dragged to the surface and examined with contemptuous precision. Fear, greed, betrayal, he tasted them all. "Thieves," the king said, his voice resonating not through the air but directly within their skulls. "Grave leeches, you crawl into my dark and dare to breathe." He took a step forward. The stone cracked beneath his foot. Azora staggered, blood trickling from her nose and ears as the necromantic pressure intensified. "He's not fully anchored," she gasped. "He's projecting partially bound. If we—" Thar-Amun raised a single finger. Azora was hurled backward as if struck by a siege hammer, her body smashing into a column hard enough to shatter stone. She slid down, unmoving, her breath a thin rattle. Diogo charged. It was a reflex born of countless duels and battles, a man's answer to terror. His saber flashed, blade humming as it cut through the stale air toward the king's throat. Thar-Amun did not turn. The blade stopped inches from his neck, frozen in mid-swing. Diogo strained, muscles screaming, veins bulging. The saber began to rust, corrosion racing along its edge in seconds. The metal crumbled into flakes, then dust. With a flick of his wrist, Thar-Amun sent Diogo flying. The duelist struck the far wall with a sickening crunch, his spine folding the wrong way. He slid down, twitching, blood bubbling from his mouth. The king turned his attention elsewhere, toward the Tilean translator. The man Alessio Ferran had been little more than a tool until now. A thin, nervous scholar fluent in half a dozen dead tongues, hired to decipher glyphs and inscriptions. He stood trembling near the back of the hall, hands pressed over his ears as if trying to block out the screaming voices that now filled his mind. Thar-Amun regarded him with interest. "You," the king said. Alessio screamed as an invisible force seized him, lifting him from the ground. His limbs flailed uselessly as he was dragged forward, feet scraping furrows in the stone. "No, please, I only translated," he babbled. tears streaming down his face. Thar-Amun extended his hand and pressed 2 fingers against Alessio's forehead. The translator went rigid. His scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet, choking gasp. His eyes rolled back, then snapped forward again, no longer his own. Green fire burned in their depths. His mouth opened, jaw cracking as it stretched impossibly wide. When he spoke, it was not Alessio's voice. It was Thar-Amun's. "Long have I waited," the king intoned through the ruined vessel. His words echoed and layered, ancient and thunderous. "Long have I been buried alive, my breath stolen, my name erased by cowards wearing priestly robes." Alessio's body convulsed as the possession deepened. Bones cracked audibly beneath his skin, reshaping to accommodate the will, forcing itself inside. Blood poured from his nose and ears, pooling at his feet. "I was king before their false gods learned fear," Thar-Amun continued. "I ruled when the dead still listened and the living obeyed. And for this," the possessed man's head snapped sideways with a sharp crack, then righted itself. "They chained me in darkness." The undead throughout the hall stirred, as if responding to a summons. Mummies beat their fists against stone coffins. Statues ground their weapons against the floor in salute. Kaldemar fell to his knees at last, overcome. "I brought you back," he said hoarsely. "I bore your heart. You opened the door," Thar-Amun corrected, eyes blazing. "That is all." The Ankh pulsed violently, tearing a scream from Kaldemar's throat as the artifact wrenched itself free from his fused flesh. Blood and charred skin came with it. The Ankh floated through the air, drifting toward the possessed translator, glowing brighter with each passing second. Alessio's body began to fail. His skin split along the arms and chest, veins rupturing as necromantic power surged through him. His spine arched backward at an impossible angle, ribs tearing free of flesh like the bars of a cage. "Witness!" Thar-Amun commanded, voice booming from the dying man's mouth. "Witness the price of remembrance!" The Ankh slammed into Alessio's chest. There was a sound like a bell tolling underwater. Alessio exploded, not outward, but inward, his body collapsing around the artifact as if crushed by an unseen fist. Bone, flesh, and blood were drawn screaming into the Ankh, absorbed in a violent implosion that left nothing behind but a scorched silhouette on the stone floor. The Ankh dropped. Thar-Amun caught it. The moment his fingers closed around the artifact, the tomb roared in triumph. Power surged outward in a shockwave that threw the remaining survivors from their feet. Coffins burst open. Ancient corpses rose in droves, weapons clutched in desiccated hands, eyes blazing with renewed purpose. Thar-Amun inhaled deeply. For the first time in millennia, air filled his lungs. "I am returned," he declared. "The debt of blood is due." He turned his burning gaze toward the living. "And I will be paid in full." Chapter 9. The March of Bone. The tomb spat them out like spoiled meat. Those who survived the awakening, fewer than a dozen, now staggered into the daylight, reeling, bloodied, and half-blind from the flash of necromantic fire. The sun had become a cruel joke. It loomed above, pale and veiled, casting a sickly, golden light that did nothing to warm the skin. The air was thick with a sullen heat, the sort that precedes something terrible, like the moment before a corpse draws a final breath it shouldn't have. The desert waited for them with open jaws. Ezora limped through the threshold last, clutching her ribs with one hand, her warding staff in the other. Diogo helped her along, one arm slung around her waist. Kaldemar stumbled behind them, a ruined figure, hands blackened from the Ank's rejection. His eyes, once glittering with manic intelligence, now stared at nothing, mouth muttering broken pieces of Thar-Amun's awakening, as if trapped in an endless loop. Buried awake, burned the gods, their breath is mine. Gorek carried the last surviving mercenary over his shoulder, a wiry Nuln pistolier whose legs had been shattered by a collapsing pillar during their retreat. His screams came and went in hoarse rasps, fading like a dying wind. They didn't speak. No one spoke. The silence clung to them, an aftershock of what they had seen, of what they had unleashed. Then the wind rose. Not a breeze, a wall. It came from the south, a seething mass of sand and ash that raced across the dunes with unnatural speed, blotting out the horizon like a tidal wave of grit. Within its churning clouds, lightning flashed black and red. Shapes moved inside the storm. Things with too many limbs, faces that weren't faces. The sound was deafening, moaning wind mixed with the clang of bronze, the rattle of bone, the distant screams of something remembering how to live again. Salvek fell to his knees, his censer held aloft, lips moving in a frantic chant to more. "The veil is broken," he gasped. "The dead are loosed. Run," Izora hissed, grabbing Diogo. "There's no cover, no fortification. We need distance." They fled, across the dunes, over sun-blasted ridges and shattered bone fields. The storm chased them, swallowing the tomb behind them. The earth shook beneath their boots. Bones surfaced from the sand, as if drawn by a magnet. Skulls, ribs, whole skeletons dragged upward by invisible hands. Arms reached from beneath dunes and pulled themselves free. Ancient warriors still clad in ceremonial armor, blades corroded but deadly. An army rose behind them, not sprinting, marching. It did not need speed. It had inevitability. The Tileans ran like men on fire. Sand tore at their skin, scoured their lungs raw. The pistolier on Gorek's back screamed until he bit his own tongue in half. Kaldemar fell twice, once hard enough to bloody his mouth, but Izora yanked him upright. She should have left him. She wanted to leave him, but she couldn't. Not yet. Ahead, the land sloped into a shallow ravine, littered with broken obelisks and sunken sarcophagi, the remnants of a funerary procession long lost to time. They staggered into the ravine as the storm crested the ridge behind them. A shriek tore through the air. Not wind, not voice, a command. The dead accelerated. Dozens, then hundreds, crested the ridge skeletons in bronze-scale armor, shields locked, spears raised, eyes burning green with unholy fire. Behind them came heavier shapes, tomb guards bearing halberds, mounted warriors on skeletal steeds, and a towering figure draped in gold-threaded rags, its face hidden behind a flawless death mask of polished obsidian. Izora recognized it instantly. One of Thar-Amun's high generals, brought back by will alone. She turned to yell, a warning, and was shot. A musket ball tore through her shoulder, spinning her sideways into the sand. She hit the ground with a cry of disbelief and pain, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. Diogo turned just in time to see the shooter. It was Brenzo, the expedition's second translator, quiet, unassuming, just a face in the background. He stood calmly beside a broken obelisk, musket raised, smoke curling from the barrel. His eyes were empty of fear. His expression was one of worship. "Forgive me," he said softly. "He offered me eternity, a name that will be remembered. You offered death. You brought this down on us," Diogo shouted, lunging forward. Brenzo dropped the musket and held up a medallion, an ancient scarab wrought from obsidian and gold. It pulsed in his palm like a heartbeat. "I serve the one true king," he whispered. You serve dust. The air around him shimmered. Sand rose in a spiral, forming claws, limbs, faces. They shrieked, lashing out at Diogo, forcing him back. Azora dragged herself behind cover, blood soaking her robe, vision swimming. Kaldemar stared blankly as the undead approached. And then came the worst of it. The storm split. From within stepped a figure twice the size of any man, wreathed in writhing shadows and cloth woven from human hair. His body glowed faintly with green flame, and the ankh pulsed at his chest. Thar-Amun had followed. He raised a hand. The scarab in Brenzo's palm shattered. The translator convulsed, spasming as his body twisted, bones cracking outward. His flesh turned grey, then black, then began to slough off in strips. His scream became laughter, Thar-Amun's laughter. His body ballooned, grew, transformed, fingers becoming talons, eyes replaced by sockets of fire. He had been rewarded. He had become vessel. The desert itself seemed to tremble in approval. Diogo lunged, swinging wildly, driving his blade deep into the creature's chest. It barely noticed. It struck him aside like a toy. The blow broke ribs. Diogo hit the sand, coughing blood, but still crawling, still trying to protect Azora. The undead reached the ravine. Arrows whistled through the air, thudding into bodies with dull, wet sounds. Spears rained down like hail. Gorek howled, charging into the swarm with nothing but his fists and madness. He tore skulls from spines. He bit a mummy's throat out, even though it had no blood to spill. He vanished beneath a tide of enemies screaming curses and laughter. Salvek died with prayer on his lips. He stood firm, censer blazing, light bursting from the relic as he screamed the names of more in every tongue he knew. The light held for a moment, then Thar-Amun spoke, and Salvek imploded. Blood and ash sprayed across the sand. Azora dragged Kaldemar behind a half-buried sarcophagus. Diogo joined her, face pale, hand pressed to his ribs. Behind them, the march continued. The bones of Nehekharan had returned to war. Kaldemar finally spoke, voice hoarse and strange. He's not just a king. He's a concept, a hatred made perpetual. They buried him to stop the world from remembering what wrath looks like. Azora stared at him, eyes bloodshot, teeth clenched. Then you should have let him rot. Chapter 10. The Scholar's Guilt. Night came without darkness. The sky above the desert was a sickly amber, stained by the storm that still churned on the horizon, its spine lit from within by corpse light and witch fire. The wind howled endlessly, carrying with it the clatter of bone on bone and the distant, disciplined tramp of the dead. Thar-Amun's army marched not with haste, but with certainty. It did not need to catch its prey. The world would eventually run out of places to flee. Kaldemar crouched in the shadow of a collapsed funerary arch, his back pressed against stone so cold it burned. His hands shook as he wrote, ink blotting the pages of his journal. Blood dripped from his nose onto the parchment. Mingling with the words, he did not wipe it away. He needed the record. Azora lay a short distance away, wrapped in torn bandages and stained robes, her breathing shallow but steady. Diogo sat beside her, back against a broken obelisk, saber across his knees, eyes hollow and alert. They spoke rarely now. Speech felt dangerous, as if words themselves might betray them. Kaldemar wrote by the light of a single guttering lantern. "If this journal is found," he scrawled, "know that I am the architect of this calamity. Not Thar-Amun, not the priests who betrayed him, not the desert itself. Me. I opened the door. I named the dead. I mistook comprehension for control. His hands cramped, fingers stiff and numb. The skin around his knuckles had turned gray, dry and cracked like old parchment. When he flexed them, flakes of skin fell away, drifting like ash. He ignored it. The scholar in him trained, disciplined, obsessive, clung to process as a drowning man clung to wreckage. He catalogued what he had seen, the structure of the tomb, the glyphs that had failed, the nature of the ankh, not merely a relic, but a metaphysical anchor, a vessel that had contained Thar-Amun's breath, his animus, while his body lay bound in ritual death. I didn't resurrect him, Kaldemar muttered aloud, voice trembling. I reunited him. Ezora stared. Stop talking, she rasped. If he hears you, he already does, Kaldemar replied quietly. I feel him, like a hand around my spine. And he did. Every heartbeat sent a pulse of pain through his chest. Not physical pain, not entirely, but a sensation of compression, as if something inside him were being slowly crushed and reshaped. His thoughts felt crowded. At times, memories surfaced that were not his own. Chanting priests, the taste of blood mixed with incense, centuries of suffocating dark punctuated by endless, burning rage. He squeezed his eyes shut and wrote faster. Thar-Amun is not sustained by simple necromancy. He's bound to oath, betrayal, and remembrance. His curse propagates through witness. Every soul that sees him, fears him, or names him, strengthens the chain that binds him to this world. Ezora forced herself upright, hissing in pain. Then stop writing, she said. Burn it. Forget him. Kaldemar looked at her with hollow eyes. Forgetting is what made him a god. The wind shifted. For a brief, terrifying moment, the sound of marching grew closer. Diogo rose to his feet, blade ready. We move, he said. Now, before... Kaldemar shook his head. No, there's only one chance left. He reached into his satchel and withdrew a bundle wrapped in oilcloth and human skin. Ezora's eyes widened in recognition. No, she whispered. You can't. That rite was banned, Kaldemar finished. Yes, by every civilized institution from Altdorf to Lucini. It requires a living anchor, a scholar's will, a sacrifice. Diogo stared at him. You're already dead. Not yet, Kaldemar said. And that matters. He spread the ritual materials on the sand with shaking hands. Powdered grave salt, ink mixed with his own blood, fragments of the shattered binding glyphs he'd scraped from the tomb walls during their flight. At the center, he placed the journal. This place is already a wound, he said. I will make myself the suture. Ezora grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak but desperate. You won't seal him, she said. You'll just give him another body. Kaldemar met her gaze. For the first time since the tomb, his expression softened not with hope, but with resignation. Then I'll fight him for it, he said. From the inside, he began to chant. The words were old, older than Nehekharan, older than Tilea. They scraped the throat raw as they were spoken, each syllable heavy with consequence. The sand around him darkened, soaked in blood and ink, forming a sigil that pulsed faintly in time with his failing heart. The ground trembled. From the horizon came a roar. Thar-Amun's voice carried on the storm. You would bind me again, little scribe? Kaldemar screamed as the curse surged. His skin split along his arms and chest, veins blackening as necromantic energy flooded his body. His left eye burst, ichor pouring down his cheek. His teeth loosened, one falling from his mouth to clatter in the sand. He did not stop chanting. Izora wept silently as she watched him rot in front of her. Kaldamar's legs gave out. He collapsed into the ritual circle, spasming violently. His flesh sagged, decaying in patches as if centuries were being forced through him all at once. His ribs became visible beneath translucent skin. His breath rattled wetly. Still, he wrote. With his remaining good hand, he dragged the pen across the page, carving words with blood when ink ran dry. The curse seeks permanence. I offer it conflict. I offer it me. Let my name replace his in the bindings. Let my memory rot so his may be forgotten again. The air screamed. The lantern exploded. Darkness swallowed the ravine, broken only by the sickly glow of the storm and the faint green fire now burning behind Kaldamar's eyes. Thar-Amun's presence pressed down like a mountain. You are nothing, the king thundered. A footnote. A breath that will fade. Kaldamar laughed. Blood filled his mouth. So did you? He rasped. For a time? He drove his blood-slicked hand into his own chest. Fingers punched through skin, muscle, bone. He screamed a raw animal sound as he grasped something inside himself that was not flesh, not soul, but connection. He pulled. The world convulsed. For a heartbeat, just one, the marching stopped. The storm faltered. Izora felt it, a wrenching sensation, like a hook tearing through her mind. Somewhere far away, Thar-Amun howled. Kaldamar collapsed fully then, body smoking, eyes wide and unseeing. His flesh had withered to something half mummified, half living. The ritual circle burned itself into the sand, then went dark. Silence fell. Not peace, but interruption. Izora crawled to him, sobbing. She pressed her ear to his chest. There was a heartbeat, faint, wrong. Kaldamar's mouth twitched. His remaining eye opened slowly, glowing faintly green gold. He smiled, or tried to. It worked, he whispered. Then he screamed, not in pain, in argument. Something inside him screamed back, and far away, beneath the storm and the sand, Thar-Amun laughed low, patient and amused because the scholar had not sealed the king. He had given him a battlefield. Chapter 11. The Oasis of Delirium. They reached the oasis at dawn, though none of them could later agree that the sun had truly risen. The desert thinned abruptly, the dunes falling away into a basin of cracked stone and salt where water shimmered in a wide, shallow pool. Palm trees leaned inward like conspirators, their fronds brittle and grey, drooping beneath the weight of centuries. The air smelled wrong, not fresh, not clean, but sweet and cloying, like rot masked with perfume. Dragonflies hovered over the water, their wings tattered and translucent, beating too slowly. Izora collapsed first. Her legs gave out without warning, and she fell hard onto the stone, breath tearing from her lungs in a ragged cry. Diogo dropped beside her instantly, hands shaking as he checked her wound. The musket ball lodged in her shoulder had festered despite his best efforts. The skin around it was blackened and puckered, veins spidering outward like ink dropped in water. She needs water, he said hoarsely. They all did. Kaldamar staggered to the pool and fell to his knees, his reflection rippling grotesquely on the surface. What looked back at him was no longer entirely human, skin drawn tight and grey, eyes sunken, one glowing faintly from within. His mouth was cracked and bloodless. The scholar he had been felt like a story told about someone else. Brother Salvek was gone. Gorek was gone. The Pistolia, the mercenaries, the translators gone. Only 5 had reached the oasis. 5 was too many. Izora tried to speak but choked instead, coughing blood into the dust. Diogo tore strips from his cloak and pressed them to her mouth. "Don't drink yet," he warned, though his own throat burned. "Let me test it." Kaldemar laughed softly. "It came out wrong, wet and hollow." "You still think this place obeys rules," he murmured. Diogo ignored him and dipped the tip of his blade into the water. The steel hissed faintly but did not corrode. He cupped a handful and sniffed it. It smelled sweet, too sweet. He hesitated. Behind him, one of the others, Marco, a lean Tilean scout with sunburned skin and haunted eyes, fell forward and plunged his face into the pool. He drank greedily, choking and laughing, water spilling down his chin. "Gods," he gasped. "It's cold, do you feel it? It's cold." Diogo reached for him. "Stop." Too late. Marco's laughter turned shrill. He stared into the water, eyes widening as if he saw something extraordinary beneath the surface. "I can see them," he whispered. "My mother, my brother, they're waving." His face slackened. Then his reflection reached up and pulled him in. The water erupted in ripples. Marco vanished beneath the surface, with barely a splash. Diogo lunged forward, hacking at the pool with his blade, but the water stilled instantly, smooth and innocent. There was no sign Marco had ever existed. Izora sobbed weakly. "It's not water," she whispered. "It's memory." The oasis fed on them. As the sun climbed, or seemed, to the air thickened with heat and hallucination, shadows bent at impossible angles. The palm trees whispered names. The pool reflected skies that did not belong to this world, black suns, inverted stars, a throne buried beneath sand. Kaldemar knelt at the edge, scribbling frantic notes into his journal with fingers that left bloody smears on the page. He wrote about the oasis's geometry, about the way its perimeter never quite stayed the same distance away. He wrote about thirst, not of the body, but of the soul. One of the remaining survivors, a broad-shouldered mercenary named Ludo, began arguing with Diogo over nothing at all. The words escalated quickly, voices rising, insults turning sharp and personal. "You led us here," Ludo snarled. "You and your damned heroics. You should have left us in the tomb. You followed," Diogo shot back. "No one chained you." Kaldemar looked up too late. Ludo drew his knife and plunged it into Diogo's side. "Isura skriamet," Diogo roared, driving his shoulder into Ludo and sending both men tumbling across the stone. They grappled savagely, blood slicking the ground, fists cracking bone. Diogo was stronger, but Ludo was desperate and mad with thirst and fear. Kaldemar watched in horror as Ludo bit into Diogo's throat like an animal. The sound was obscene. Izora dragged herself forward, sobbing, hands clawing uselessly at the ground. "Stop," she begged. "Please." Kaldemar did not think. He moved. The curse inside him surged eagerly, sensing violence. Green-gold fire burst from his palm as he struck Ludo's back. Flesh blackened and split. Ludo screamed, his body seizing as necromantic energy ripped through him, aging him decades in seconds. His skin shriveled, his teeth fell out, his eyes collapsed into dark sockets. He died convulsing atop Diogo. Kaldemar staggered back, horrified at himself. Diogo lay still, blood pouring from his throat. Izora crawled to him, pressing her hands to the wound, whispering frantic, useless words. His eyes fluttered open briefly. "Don't let him right us wrong," he whispered. Then he was gone. The oasis laughed. The ground trembled. From the far end of the basin, stone shifted. A massive shape rose slowly from beneath the sand, a sphinx, once regal, now mummified and broken. Its leonine body was wrapped in rotting linen, ribs visible beneath dried flesh. Its wings were tattered stone and bone, its claws long and serrated. The face was human, ancient, eyes hollow but burning with cold awareness. The guardian had awakened. It spoke without moving its mouth, its voice echoing directly inside their minds. You drink of what is forbidden. You remember what should remain buried. Azora screamed as the sound tore through her skull. Kaldemar dropped to one knee, clutching his head as ancient riddles and half-formed questions flooded his thoughts. Impossible queries meant not to be answered, only to break the mind. The Sphinx advanced, each step shaking the basin. Azora dragged herself upright, staff trembling in her grip. "I can bind it," she gasped. "For a moment. Long enough for me to die," Kaldemar finished quietly. She met his gaze. "You're already dying." The Sphinx lunged. Azora unleashed her spell, sigils blazing in the air, chains of light wrapped around the creature's limbs, burning into its wrappings. It roared a sound like stone grinding against stone and tore free one wing, flinging it aside in an explosion of debris that crushed the last remaining survivor beneath it. Kaldemar rose unsteadily, every step agony. He screamed words of binding, of denial, of erasure. The curse inside him answered eagerly, flaring outward. His flesh sloughed from his bones in places, but he did not stop. He drove his hands into the sand and pulled, drawing the oasis power into himself. The Sphinx reared back, shrieking. Azora hurled her staff like a spear, driving it through the creature's skull. The Sphinx collapsed forward, its massive body crashing into the pool. The water boiled, then turned black, then evaporated entirely, leaving only cracked stone and salt. Silence fell. Only three remained. Azora, bleeding and shaking, Kaldemar, half rotted and burning from within, and the desert itself, watching patiently. The oasis was gone. So was any illusion of mercy. Chapter 12. The King's Wrath. They knew he was coming before they ever saw him. The desert announced Thar-Amun's approach, not with sound alone, but with wrongness. The air thickened until every breath felt stolen. The sand beneath their feet grew warm, then hot, then feverish, as though something vast and furious lay just below the surface, rolling in its sleep. The horizon bent inward, curving like a clenched fist. Distance became meaningless. Dunes that should have been hours away loomed suddenly close, while landmarks behind them stretched into impossibility. Azora staggered, clutching her head as blood leaked from her nose once more. "He's here," she whispered. "Not behind us, around us." Kaldemar said nothing. He walked with the stiff, jerking gait of a corpse forced to remember motion, his skin grey and cracked, patches of it sloughing away to reveal blackened muscle beneath. Each step left faint glyphs burned into the sand marks he did not intend, symbols dragged from his body by the curse, still fighting for dominion inside him. He could feel Thar-Amun now, not as a distant presence or echo, but as a will pressing against his own, vast and inexorable. The king no longer needed intermediaries. The scholar's ritual had delayed the march of bone, disrupted the machinery of undeath, but it had also drawn Thar-Amun's attention with agonizing clarity. The king had decided to finish this himself. The desert screamed. Sand surged upward in a rolling wall, swallowing the sky. Wind howled with voices layered atop one another, priests begging forgiveness, soldiers screaming oaths of loyalty, children crying for parents long turned to dust. The storm did not obscure vision. It replaced it. Shapes appeared and vanished, cities half buried, battlefields choked with corpses, temples collapsing in reverse, stones flying upward to rebuild monuments long destroyed. Izora fell to her knees, retching. "He's rewriting," she gasped. "The land he's making it, remember." A shadow fell across them. Thar-Amun emerged from the storm as if stepping through a veil. He was no longer bound by the physical limitations of his corpse. His form flickered between solidity and something else, an outline of gold and bone filled with roaring green fire. His crown burned bright now, reforged by belief and blood. The Ankh hovered at his chest, orbiting slowly, pulsing with every heartbeat that was not a heartbeat. When he walked, the ground cracked. When he spoke, the sky answered. "Run," Izora whispered. Though she did not move, Kaldamar turned to face him. Thar-Amun's gaze locked onto the scholar, and for a moment the storm stilled, as if the world itself leaned closer to listen. "You bleed beautifully," the king said, his voice layered with the weight of eternity. "You carry my curse like a brand. You should have been born in my age." Kaldamar's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. "You should have stayed buried." The desert convulsed. A fissure split the ground between them, swallowing Izora up to her waist before Kaldamar dragged her free with a grunt of pain. The sand beneath them liquefied, turning into a sucking mire that clawed at their boots, their ankles, their bones. "Go!" Kaldamar rasped to her. "I'll slow him." Izora laughed a short, broken sound. "You can barely slow yourself." Thar-Amun raised his hand. The sand rose in jagged spires, forming colossal hands that slammed down where Ezra and Kaldamar stood moments before. They ran, stumbling, bleeding, half-blind through a landscape that actively hunted them. Dunes collapsed into sinkholes. Stone erupted from beneath the sand like spears. Shadows detached from their owners and tried to strangle them. Izora screamed as a mirage formed directly ahead, a vision of clean water, of green grass, of safety. She slammed into it at full speed, only to rebound off solid stone. Blood burst from her forehead. She slumped, dazed. Thar-Amun appeared before her, without crossing the distance between. He loomed over her, impossibly tall, shadow swallowing her broken body. The Ankh flared, casting her in gold light. "You drank from my oasis," he said calmly. "You slew my guardian. Your death will be slow." Kaldamar hurled himself between them. The king's gaze flicked to him, amused. "Still resisting?" Kaldamar screamed as the curse surged, his body tearing itself apart from the inside. Bone jutted from his forearm, his jaw cracked, teeth splintering, but he held, forcing the competing wills within him to clash violently enough to disrupt the king's focus. "Izora," he croaked. "Run." She staggered to her feet, sobbing, hatred and grief burning brighter than fear. She turned and ran not away, but around, drawing symbols in the sand with her blood, dragging ancient wards into being with shaking hands. She was not sealing Thar-Amun. She was lying to him, convincing the land, briefly, that he was not fully present. The desert hesitated. Thar-Amun snarled, his patience fractured. He struck Kaldamar. The blow did not break bone. It unmade it. Kaldamar's torso collapsed inward, ribs folding like wet parchment, organs liquefying under the force. He screamed, not in pain, but in defiance, clutching at the king's arm as if he could anchor himself there. "Look at you," Thar-Amun said softly. "Still writing your ending." Kaldamar laughed, blood pouring from his mouth. "Someone has to record your failure." The king tore his arm free. Kaldamar was flung across the sand, landing in a boneless heap that did not move. Izora screamed his name. Thar-Amun turned toward her, wrath fully unleashed now. The storm intensified, lightning cracking red across the sky. The sand rose in waves, swallowing landmarks, trying to erase all paths of escape. "You cannot flee history," the king thundered. "I am what comes after." Azora ran until her lungs burned and her vision tunneled. The desert closed around her, reshaping itself to block her path. Walls of sand rose. The ground split open beneath her feet. Then silence. A ruin emerged ahead, an ancient temple half buried, its stones scorched and cracked, glyphs of binding etched deep into its bones. A place meant for one purpose only. Azora stumbled toward it, as the desert howled behind her. Behind her, Thar-Amun advanced, unstoppable, inexorable. The king's wrath had fully awakened, and the land itself bent the knee. Chapter 13. The Final Seal. The temple rose from the desert like a wound that had never healed. Its stones were blackened and fused, melted together by forces far older than fire. Half of it had sunk into the sand, swallowed by time and deliberate erasure, while the rest leaned at a precarious angle, columns cracked and split, lintels carved with sigils so deeply etched they looked gouged in hatred. The air around it felt colder than the desert night should allow, heavy with warded silence. Even the wind avoided it, skirting the ruin as if afraid to disturb what slept beneath. Azora crossed the threshold alone. Her legs trembled with every step. Blood matted her hair, dried in thick, rusted clots along her temple. Her vision swam, the world doubling and blurring, but she forced herself onward, clutching the last of her ritual tools to her chest like a drowning woman clutching driftwood. She did not look back. She could not. The temple had been built to fail. Azora recognized it immediately. The geometry was wrong. The angles subtly skewed, designed not to channel power cleanly but to fracture it. Every surface bore counter-sigils, denials carved atop denials, layers of magical refusal piled upon one another until the stone itself radiated exhaustion. This was not a place of worship. It was a place of containment. A scar left behind after an act so terrible that even memory had been sealed away with it. She collapsed near the center dais, gasping, and dragged herself upright using a fallen altar. At its heart lay a circular depression filled with ash and powdered bone, what remained of a previous binding, centuries old and still faintly warm with residual power. "Please," she whispered, not to gods she had long since stopped believing in their mercy, but to the dead stone itself. "Hold, just once more." Behind her, the desert screamed. Thar-Amun's presence slammed into the ruin like a siege engine. The walls shook. Dust rained from the ceiling in choking clouds. The glyphs along the columns flared briefly, sputtered, then stabilized, glowing with a dull, defiant light. Azora screamed as the pressure hit her visions, tearing through her mind. Cities burning, priests flayed alive, children entombed screaming so their souls would scream forever alongside their king. Thar-Amun's memories bled into her, raw and merciless. "You return to the cage." The king's voice boomed from everywhere and nowhere. "You learned nothing." A shadow fell across the shattered doorway. Thar-Amun entered the temple. He had shed pretense now. His form towered over the ruin, a towering amalgam of bone, gold, and incandescent rage. The ankh burned like a miniature sun at his chest. Each step he took cracked the stone beneath him, ancient wards screaming as they strained to hold his presence at bay. "You cannot bind me again," he said calmly. "The price has already been paid." Azora spat blood and staggered to her feet. "No," she rasped. "It hasn't." Something moved behind her. She turned, heart lurching. Kaldemar dragged himself into the temple on ruined limbs, his body barely holding together. His ribcage had collapsed inward, one leg twisted uselessly beneath him. His skin was grey and parchment dry, stretched tight over bone. One eye was gone, the socket a blackened pit leaking ichor, yet he was alive, aware, and the curse inside him burned like a second, malignant heart. Professor, Ezora sobbed. Kaldemar laughed weakly, blood bubbling from his mouth. "You should see the footnotes," he croaked. "This story refuses to end neatly." Thar-Amun turned slowly. Recognition flared, then satisfaction. "You again?" the king said. "You persist like rot." Kaldemar hauled himself upright using the altar, shaking violently. "I persist," he wheezed, "because you still care." The king's eyes burned brighter. "You think that gives you power?" "No," Kaldemar said softly. "It gives me leverage." Izora stared at him, realization dawning with horror. "No," she whispered. "No, you can't." Kaldemar met her gaze, what remained of it steady and resolute. "You said it yourself," he murmured. "The binding requires a willing anchor, a living mind, a scholar's will." "You'll be annihilated," she said. "There won't be anything left. Not even memory." Kaldemar smiled faintly. "Good. He feeds on remembrance." Thar-Amun advanced, each step shaking the temple. "Enough," he thundered. "I will tear the knowledge from your skull and leave your corpse screaming in the sand." Kaldemar slammed his bloodied hand onto the altar. The temple answered. Glyphs ignited across the walls, floor, and ceiling, blazing white-hot. The air screamed as ancient bindings reasserted themselves, drawing upon everything the structure had been built to deny. Izora was thrown backward, slamming into a column hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. Kaldemar began the chant. His voice was barely more than a rasp, but the words carried power far beyond their volume. He spoke names that had not been uttered since before recorded history. He spoke equations of will, denials layered upon denials, truths twisted into weapons. With every syllable, his body deteriorated further, flesh sloughing away, bones blackening, his form collapsing inward as the curse and the ritual tore him apart from opposite ends. Thar-Amun roared and struck the barrier. The blow sent cracks racing through the temple walls. The glyphs flickered but held. Ezora dragged herself upright, screaming the counter-chant, her voice joining Kaldemar's in ragged harmony. She carved sigils into her own flesh with a broken blade, feeding the ritual with pain and blood, tears streaming down her face. "It needs more," she screamed. "The seal is weakening." Kaldemar nodded weakly. "It always does." He turned toward Thar-Amun, meeting the king's blazing gaze. "You were betrayed," Kaldemar said hoarsely. "Buried alive, forgotten. But you were stopped, and now you will be stopped again." Thar-Amun lungered. The barrier shattered. The king's clawed hand punched straight through Kaldemar's chest. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Kaldemar gasped, eyes wide, not in fear, but in grim triumph. He seized Thar-Amun's arm with both hands, pulling himself closer despite the agony. "Willing," he whispered. The ritual snapped shut. The temple screamed as power inverted, collapsing inward. Glyphs tore free of the stone and wrapped around Thar-Amun like chains of light. The Ankh flared violently, then dimmed as its power was ripped away, dragged screaming into the collapsing seal. Thar-Amun howled a sound of pure, incandescent fury as the bindings closed around him. "You cannot erase me," the king roared. "I will be remembered. I will." Kaldemar leaned close. blood pouring from his mouth. "No," he whispered. "You'll be studied." He drove the last of his will into the ritual. The seal closed. Thar-Amun was torn from the physical world, dragged back into containment along with the screaming remnants of his power. The ankh shattered into molten fragments that sank into the altar like tears of gold. Kaldoma collapsed. Azora screamed his name and crawled to him as the temple fell silent, its glyphs guttering out one by one. Kaldoma lay still, body ruined beyond recognition. His remaining eye fluttered open once. "Right it wrong," he whispered. "Let them forget." Then his body turned to ash. The temple settled. The desert grew still. The final seal held. Chapter 14. The desert takes all. Silence hung over the desert like a burial shroud. Where once a temple stood veined with ancient defiance, cracked by the weight of wrath and sacrifice, there was now only scorched stone and glassy sand, fused together by a power too immense for mortal memory. The wind moved slowly, as if uncertain the danger had passed. No voices remained, no footsteps, no birds, no carrion insects. Even time itself seemed reluctant to intrude. The final seal held, but not without cost. Azora emerged from the ruins with the gate of the damned. Her skin was blistered and cracked from the ritual's backlash, her robes half-burned and drenched in drying blood. One eye had gone blind from the blast of necromantic light. The other swam with visions she could no longer tell were real. She carried nothing, not her staff, not her books, not even her name, really. Whatever Azora Malfi had been, a scholar, a heretic, a survivor, had been left behind in the dust and fire of that place. The heat pressed down like judgment. The sky boiled above her, colorless and uncaring. She walked, not because she believed in escape, or salvation, or even survival, but because something in her blood still remembered how to move. One foot, then the other. Her bare soul split open against the rocks. Her mouth was dry, tongue stuck to the roof like leather. She could no longer cry. Her tears had been traded for the names of the dead. The desert opened before her and closed behind. Sand erased her steps as she made them. Time swam. She slept only when her body collapsed, waking with screams on her lips that belonged to other people. Sometimes she heard Diogo calling to her. Sometimes she saw Kaldemar in the dunes, writing with fingers worn down to bone, whispering apologies to no one. The desert did not speak to her. It watched. On the fourth day, she found a shrine. It had once been grand away station for pilgrims long since devoured by time. Now only the skeletal frame of an obelisk remained, leaning sideways like a snapped finger. Beneath it lay a half-buried skeleton, with scraps of priestly vestments still clinging to brittle bones. Around its neck hung a silver medallion, etched with the eye of Patra, cracked straight through. Azora sat beside the corpse and laughed until her voice broke. The wind did not answer. She chewed leather, drank dew from cupped palms, licked the condensation from her own breath when it pooled in cracks of rock. When hallucinations came, she didn't fight them. She watched ancient armies march across the sand in silence, watched cities burn beneath black suns, watched herself flayed and reassembled by unseen hands. They spoke to her in tongues she could not unhear. They whispered truths no sane mind would retain. She wrote them down on her own skin with sharpened bone, each word a fragment, each phrase a warning, each stroke a wound. On the 9th day, she reached Xandre, or what remained of it. The city was no longer the forgotten ruin she had seen upon landing. Something had shifted. Crumbling towers stood taller now, leaning at impossible angles. Obelisks glowed faintly under the moonlight, their surfaces etched with symbols that had not been visible before. The harbor was choked with kelp and corpses, ships wrecked along jagged reefs that hadn't existed a week prior. The waters were still. Izora stumbled through the gates. Fishermen saw her first, if they were truly fishermen, and not the ghosts she now counted among the living. They watched in silence as she limped past, hair tangled with dried blood, lips split into a permanent rictus, feet black with rot. Her arms were covered in writing, shoulders marked with scarification in the shape of wards and glyphs that pulsed under the skin. She spoke in riddles, sometimes in Telean, sometimes in Nehekharan, sometimes in tongues that had not been spoken since the desert had water. She warned of bones rising to rule flesh, of tombs beneath tombs, of names that must never be remembered. She cursed the sun, praised the dead, screamed about the second burial and the third betrayal. The townsfolk kept their distance. They called her the Morning Mouth, the Ash Prophet, the Mad Scholar. Some offered water. She refused. Some offered prayers. She laughed. A few fled. A few stayed too long and claimed they heard the words whispering behind her teeth even when her mouth was shut. She returned each night to the same place, a crumbling rooftop overlooking the sea. There she would stand in silence, staring east into the desert, waiting, listening. Sometimes she would weep without sound. Other times she would smile, and on moonless nights she would whisper his name, not Thar-Amun, for that was the lie, not the cursed king, but the man who had given her the final breath of a doomed world. Kalduma, she whispered, over and over. You were right. You should have lied more. The desert swallowed the tomb again, but it did not bury what had awakened. It merely waited, and far beneath the dunes, beneath a scorched seal of ash and blood and defiant will, something vast and forgotten dreamed, not peacefully, not restfully, but with a slow, venomous patience. Because names are never truly forgotten, only misremembered. And Thar-Amun, the twice buried, the king beneath sand and memory, would not remain misremembered forever. Chapter 15. The manuscript closed. The vaulted reading chamber of the Antiquarian Guild in Miragliano was cold unnaturally, so as though the walls themselves had exhaled centuries of winter into the room. Tapered candles burned along the oak table, but their light seemed unable to penetrate the gloom, each flame dancing with a restless, accusing flicker. The smell was familiar, old vellum, dust, and a hint of something feral beneath it all, something like old spice or rot, preserved in wine. Scholar Martello shivered, even though the day outside was warm, Mediterranean sun leaking through high windows. The sunlight didn't reach this chamber. It never did. Shadow clung to the corners as if it lived there. Before him lay the Kaldoma manuscript open to its final page. The ink was smeared with dark flecks that might have once been blood, now faded to a dull copper hue. Martello had been staring at the words for hours, reading and rereading, as though repetition could inoculate him against the dread twist that had formed in his gut. Beside the manuscript rested the golden ankh. He had been told not to open it. The guildmasters had whispered behind closed doors. They had draped wards across the doorframe like funeral garlands. They had said words like dangerous, apocryphal, forbidden. But forbidden things have a gravity. Curiosity is a subtle tyranny. Martello's fingers trembled as he reached for the ankh. It was warm, a slow, radiant warmth that pulsed faintly in the silence, like a heartbeat muffled beneath thick cloth. He palmed it instinctively, and for a moment the manuscripts and candles and dust-dark corners faded into nothing but sensation. The thrum under his skin, the vibration at his temples, the sudden sick taste of copper on his tongue. The manuscript said much too much, but the ending had gnawed at him like a worm in the heart of an apple. Let my name replace his in the bindings. Let my memory rot so his may be forgotten again. Martello had read those lines so often he could recite them blind, but the margin note beneath them, scrawled in Caldemar's dying hand, was what froze his breath. If this fails, memory will be the coffin. The scholar sat back, eyes locked on the ankh. Its glow was faint, almost apologetic, but there, not extinguished, not dormant, alive. Martello exhaled a brittle laugh. "It can't be," he whispered. "It's an artifact, an old relic, a myth." He trailed off as the room shifted. Not physically. The shadows breathed. A candle flickered once, twice, and the flame pulsed in rhythm with the ankh. The walls seemed to lean in closer, as though the chamber itself wanted to listen. A cold draught brushed Martello's neck, and he swore he heard at times whisper, times a syllable so faint he wasn't sure it was real. But one thing about the desert dead was undeniable. They spoke in riddles first and truths last. The chill crept up his spine. Martello opened the manuscript again, eyes darting across the final passages, entries that detailed madness, ruin, sacrifice, and a binding ritual carved from terror and breath and blood. He read about Caldemar's descent, about how the ritual had cost him his body and seized his mind, and how a storm of bone and wrath had been halted for a time by desperate will. Then a line he had missed before nestled in the margin, tiny, almost illegible, as if written by someone with failing strength. "Shall the seal weaken, the name shall rise anew." Desolate, Martello dropped the manuscript. The wind in the chamber hissed. He looked at the ankh. It glowed brighter now, still timid, but unmistakable, like a candle that knows it should not shed light. Its warmth had spread, and the air around it vibrated with an energy that was neither wholly arcane nor wholly natural. A drumming pulsed in Martello's ears, deeper and slower at first, like a heartbeat, but foreign, ancient. He reached for the manuscript again, his hand unsteady. The pages rustled before he touched them, as though an unseen breath had exhaled across them. A single glyph on the page, shimmered ink, turned iridescent, then black, then faded again. Martello's heart leapt, but his mind recoiled. He tested the air with a frisson of dread and whispered, "This cannot be mere myth." And yet the silence answered him with another whisper, closer this time. Martello froze. His skin prickled. The candlelight flickered, then died at the far end of the chamber. A quarter of the room fell into darkness, and that darkness seemed thicker than the rest, as if something unlit had unwrapped itself from the corners and begun to move. His breath caught. Then, from the shadows, a movement. Not a person, not quite. It was like a ripple, a distortion of light and shadow across the wall behind him. The shape stretched, lengthened, and coalesced into something vaguely humanoid. Its edges were blurred, as though seen through hot air or beneath water. But there was an unmistakable presence about it, a weight of attention that pressed upon Martello's senses with unrelenting gravity. The ankh flared. The manuscript's pages fluttered violently, as though caught in a tempest no eye could see. Martello's chair scraped backward, his hands clutching the edges of the table as though bracing himself for a tidal wave of dread. The shape stepped forward, not quite solid, not yet defined, but in motion, and it spoke, not in words, but in memory. A voice, older than bronze, older than dynasty, older than empire. a voice that thrummed in the marrow and carved riddles into the back of the throat. Remember? Martello's jaw worked, as though his tongue and lips no longer recognized the language they tried to form. In his mind, he saw shifting sands, dunes that writhed like serpents, and the Hall of Kings, a vast hypogeum of black stone and burning glyphs. He saw figures carved in relief, faces twisted in anguish, figures bound and broken, the long line of the dead walking beneath suns that burned black. Recall? The shape solidified, bony, tall, and wrapped in linen whose edges writhed like smoke. Its eyes were pits that pulled light inward, and its presence carried the magnetic pulse of something vast. Martello knew instinctively what stood before him, the echo of Thar-Amun himself, not fully manifested, not fully corporeal, but awakened in resonance with the artifact at the table. The Ank's glow intensified, casting sickly gold across the scholar's face. Martello's breath came in ragged gulps. His mind splintered between understanding and terror. He sank to his knees. The room seemed to tilt. From the shadow figure came a whisper, not spoken, not heard, but felt. "Do you remember me?" Memories flooded Martello, not his own. A throne sealed in sand, a king betrayed. Betrayal measured in centuries, pain that became eternity. A hand clawed, gold-veined, lifting the Ankh. The sensation overwhelmed him. His eye twitched. Sweat and tears mingled on his cheeks. The manuscript fell open to the final passage, ink shimmering once more. Words he had memorized now danced like malignant flame. "The name shall rise anew." The ground beneath him seemed to shudder. His body trembled. The visions surged. The desert, the dead, the king. "Speak my name." Martello's lips quavered. His voice emerged fragile, fractured, barely coherent. "The Thar," he choked. The chamber went still. The Ankh pulsed. The figure advanced, step by slow step. No sound but the thrum in Martello's ears and the rhythm of his own terror pounding like war drum in his chest. "Remember more." The voice was no longer distant. It was inside him. Martello felt the blood drain from his face. His hands gripped the table so hard his nails carved grooves into the wood. His mind threatened to unravel. Memories he had never lived ruptured through him. Visions of dust-choked corridors, of amber flames licking stone walls, of bones rising to answer an unearthly command. "Remember!" The Ankh's glow flared white. Martello screamed, not in agony, but in recognition. And in that moment, he understood, not with logic, not with scholarship, but with every trembling fiber of his being. The cycle was not ended. It was beginning again. The manuscript closed itself. The room plunged into darkness, and the desert, ancient, hungry, remembered, smiled.